What we wanted to do is give everyone a little bit of context into the speakers. So Bret Weinstein, Heather Iain, Iain McGilchrist, Jordan Greenhall, a little bit of background to their thought as preparation for the summit, and also talk a little bit about what the summit is and what it entails for you as a participant, because it's not the regular kind of talk where we might go and listen to someone. At the summit, everyone's a participant, and in a particular way, which we're going to talk about in a bit more detail.
So Rebel Wisdom, the media channel, has existed for a bit over a year now. And one of the things that many of the people we've interviewed have in common, and certainly the four speakers who we have coming to the summit, is this idea that we're in the middle of a sense-making crisis. And the mission of Rebel Wisdom is very much, how do we make sense of the sense-making crisis, if that's not too meta already. And that sense-making crisis takes many different forms, and definitely a big part of that is this shift from broadcast to digital, and also the increased polarization that we're definitely seeing through social media, and this kind of feeling that we all have of being pushed further and further into very ideological camps, and how that's kind of increased, and how it's much more difficult to have conversations across those divides. And so a real world event is a really important part of how do we model those conversations, those generative conversations. We'll talk a bit more about that and even the sort of physiology of that kind of generative conversation later in this film. But what's clearly necessary is that we are able to enter into generative dialogue with each other, where we're not just broadcasting what we think at each other, we are having a conversation that can build on itself. And that's why we've invited the four people that we have to the summit, because we were very impressed with them when we interviewed them, and we know that they're able to enter into that space. And so very quickly introducing them. So firstly, Bret Weinstein and Heather Iain. Bret and Heather are both evolutionary biologists. They're also husband and wife. And they were both teaching in the same college, Evergreen, in the US, up until just over a year ago. And famously, and I say famously, if you don't know their history in Evergreen, we're going to put a couple of links in the show notes below this that you can watch and get a bit of a background. But they famously had this run-in with student activists in Evergreen and had to leave. But what's really fascinating is that they were teaching evolutionary biology, some of the most difficult hot-button topics right now in the media about sort of sex differences between men and women, in one of the most progressive colleges in the country, and so have a huge amount of experience of teaching tricky, difficult topics in environments where that can be misinterpreted.
There are tremendous lessons, and the key to what Heather and I were doing was that we started out by engineering a community that was safe to have discussions in. Discussions that, were we to take what was said in our classroom and to import it into a faculty meeting, would have caused a conflagration, for sure. But you have a group of students. It's a question of broadening their worldview so that they can understand that all of the things that they know they care about, all of the things that they find fun to do, all of the pursuits that drive them, their loves, their passions, that all of these things are products of evolution. And that means that understanding evolution provides a kind of roadmap against the inner confusion. That's a very powerful incentive for people to embrace it. So the answer to your question is, you provide the safety to explore, where people quickly get the idea that they are not going to be backed against the wall for saying something that sounds radical or off. And then there's the incentive to have the conversation, which comes from the fact that you get something positive for it. You know, to understand yourself, to understand why people interact in the way they do, is a very powerful advantage. And if you're presented with the question of, would you like to endure some discomfort in order to have the power to understand your own life, almost everybody will say yes.
We were able to talk about difficult subjects pretty easily, right? In some ways it was what students were signing up for. I did the two kinds of programs that I did most were vertebrate evolution, which did not veer too much into politically dangerous territory, but animal behavior is rife with it. You can't not go there if you want to do it honestly. And so talking about and humans are animals, so we didn't veer from humans, and in fact, all of the seminars that I tended to do in those programs were specifically on human evolution readings, what our history has looked like, and mostly our prehistory. And frankly, students, especially from historically marginalized and oppressed groups, were particularly interested. Several people told me nearly every year I taught this material that they were particularly interested to finally get a read on what it was that evolution had to say about being gay, or about different races, or about, especially, in my case, I would teach a lot on sex and gender, and on what it was to be male versus female.
The next speaker we want to introduce is Iain McGilchrist, who's definitely one of the most maybe revolutionary and fascinating thinkers we've come across since we've been doing this. So Iain's a psychiatrist and a philosopher, and he wrote a book called The Master and His Emissary, where he really took a much wider view of the left-right brain split that we all have, and looking not only at how it influences how we perceive reality, but also how it might have influenced the development of culture as well. And I think that is a really fascinating view on the sense-making crisis.
We're not aware that our reality is constructed by two different systems, if you like, which focus on different aspects of reality and therefore construe a world with different qualities. And the first part of the book explains that in terms of neuropsychiatry and philosophy. And the second part of the book suggests that in the history of the West, 3 times we have been in a position where, to begin with, a civilization flourished when it kept both these visions together, that of the right hemisphere and that of the left. But that in every case, and I believe we're repeating the pattern for the 3rd time, as the civilization overreached itself, things deteriorated and the mindset became more rigid, more bureaucratic, less imaginative, less flexible, less in touch with reality, and became locked into a way of thinking which is that of the left hemisphere, which is useful. It's not a mistake that we have it, but it cannot be our way of contacting reality. A simple way of putting it is it's like mistaking the map for the territory.
We talk a lot on this channel about the meta conversation. The idea that what we need is a conversation that opens up to the not knowing, to what needs to emerge beyond, and what it feels like is happening now, increasingly with social media, is people are getting stuck more and more in certainty and in what they do know. Is that a right brain, left brain phenomena?
Well, it can be looked at in that way, in that one of the features of the left hemisphere is that it prefers what it's already familiar with, and it finds it very difficult to shift set. So once it's stuck into something, it keeps on repeating it. So the left hemisphere's take is an exclusive one. Either this is right or that is right, and therefore what I know excludes what you know. Whereas the right hemisphere's take is a both-and take, that there's a room for what the left hemisphere does. There's a point in analysis, but there's also a point in synthesis and imagination. And what we are desperately lacking is that overall synthesis. It seems to me that at the moment we officially pride ourselves on being a very free-thinking people. I'm going to sound like a terrible fuddy-duddy, but I think the intellectual world was far more open in the 60s and 70s when I grew up than it is today. It's closed down to a number of dogmas. The internet, which is a wonderful thing, hasn't helped because it's possible for people to get trapped in bubbles where they reinforce the things they believe without really hearing other points of view.
And last but not least is Jordan Greenhall. Jordan is kind of difficult to define. I guess you'd probably call him a futurist writer. He wrote a piece that went pretty viral after the Trump election called Deep Code Situational Assessment, in which he basically kind of said, this is what I think is going on with the Trump election and this is what's likely to happen next. And he introduced a whole load of concepts that we found incredibly helpful to kind of make sense of the world. The insurgency, the blue church, and he talked a lot about how we're moving from like a broadcast modality in many different areas of life, where one speaks and others listen, to a networked digital modality and what that means for society. And the idea of the blue church being this kind of, this framework that had taken us through from probably the Second World War onwards and was now breaking down. And all of the media institutions and a lot of our kind of academic institutions are part of this blue church concept. But if that's breaking down, what happens and what's likely to happen next?
And it is certainly the case that in this moment, in order to speak honestly, requires courage. And I was going to say, in particular, when what you have to say is not that which is in alignment with good opinion. But oddly enough, I think it's even when it is in alignment with good opinion. Because I think there's something in the ambient environment that feels honesty as a bad thing in and of itself. Like almost a complicity to always be ever so slightly ironic and never be fully connected to trying to speak honestly. But at the same time, human beings have evolved. In fact, one would even say it's the essence of what we are that differentiates us from our primate ancestors, to be very, very attracted to honest, insightful expression. Oftentimes in history, we've needed that something to make it. Right? The situation was not easy. The situation was complex, challenging. And so it required that something, that whatever it is that happens when we are gathered together in a space of, well, collaboration. Let's just make it, again, very simple. A space of peace, a space of mutual understanding, not for the purpose of delivering on the same opinion, but really for going deep and trying to find something which is trying to frankly express itself, like to listen. And so, if that story, the story that I just told, is true, then it would be in our bones. You know, it would be in our deepest mythology, in our deepest traditions, our deepest religion, that this is the place to go. That when trouble is brewing, gather together, enter into this space. This is where we do these sorts of things. This is how we solve these kinds of problems.
So those are our 4 speakers, and now we want to talk a little bit about what we're actually going to be doing at the summit and how we're going to be doing it, which is probably more important. We've been doing events like this for about a year now, on a smaller scale. So we've had evening events where we've had a speaker, and then we've broken off into groups to discuss and really figure out how we feel about it personally, and then be in a dialogue with one another. And there's been a real hunger for that, and that's been very exciting to do. So the summit is by far the biggest event we've done, and we've capped it at 150 people. And partly because we want to keep it intimate, we want to have an environment where we really can get into dialogue with each other, and we're going to be breaking off into groups, so a number higher than that is difficult to do that with. It's also, coincidentally, the Dunbar number, which is, from an Oxford professor, Robin Dunbar, pointed out that 150 people is about the amount where you can kind of have coherence within a group, and beyond that, it becomes more difficult to do that.
So we've always run retreats as well as the media side, where we work with meditation and we work with kind of all of these ways of kind of hacking our physiology to get into these spaces. And what I think is really, if you look into that world, what you see is a lot of understanding of overwhelm and how that puts us into either we're in an exploratory mode towards the world or we're in a defensive mode. And there's many different models that show that. And we've actually got a film coming up that we're working on at the moment, which is about the physiology, kind of the physiology of generative dialogue, with Peter Levine, who is a kind of a superstar in the world of trauma and growth.
When our nervous system is in the sympathetic arousal state, the fight or flight, we will perceive the person, there's no way we won't perceive the person as an enemy, as an adversary. That's just the way we're wired. And again, the question is how we get from there to here. Here being social engagement.
You know, one thing is important for me is that we hold it lightly, because in a sense we are all participating in an experiment at the summit, and also that we kind of try our best to get into a space of what's called coherence together. And I think it's interesting to hear Jordan Greenhall talk about what that word means.
So coherence is when people are able to enter into a relationship where they basically begin to form an emergent whole, has emergent properties that is greater than the individuals involved, greater than the sum of the parts. And to achieve coherence, first and foremost, requires both sovereignty and awareness of sovereignty. I mean, you have it and you're aware of where you are, and a continual consciousness of recognizing that you have to maintain a certain level of sovereignty to be able to enter into coherence at all. And that being in coherence has the highest intelligence, has the highest capacity to perceive and respond to whatever's going on. So you prioritize that. So first, am I in sovereignty? Yes. Okay, cool. Now are we in coherence? Yes. Okay, cool. Now let's start trying to do something. If not, if something's out of coherence, okay, how do we get back in coherence? Oh, is it because I'm out of sovereignty? Okay, let me get back into sovereignty. And kind of building back up.
So we're hoping that the summit is going to be fascinating. I'm sure it will be with the speakers that we've got, but also fun. And if you were to distill down what, say, 3 or 4 principles of having a generative conversation in good faith are, what would they be?
What conditions allow for that? So how do you know you're having one? Maybe like what are the signals that you're actually doing it right? That you're actually having a good conversation? No rote apologies. Apologies for actual wrongs, but no rote apologies. Do not apologize for things that you did not actually do. And if you see sort of a culture of rote apology in a big conversation, there's probably fear right underneath the surface. Similarly, I would say look for laughter, look for humor, look for, and not just, you know, everyone can tell the difference between nervous laughter and regular from the gut laughter in which things, even when you didn't see something coming, or maybe that's often when things get funny, when a conversation that was very serious or very technical suddenly erupts in laughter, if that can happen, there's probably not fear right beneath the surface.
And then another thing we're hoping to do at the summit is create an environment where we can integrate opposites, because very often polarization we see in culture comes from not being able to hold 2 things at the same time. And being able to do that is a huge skill that helps us go a long way in having a new type of conversation.
This brings us to a very important metaphysical point, which is that a thing and its opposite, according to the left hemisphere, are simply as far apart as they can be, and we move always in a linear way to what we'd identify as good. Everything I know tells me that in fact opposites are connected, and if you pretend that you are only having one, you don't notice the dark side. And this is terribly true in psychiatry. It's almost a truism to say that a lot of the work one does as a psychiatrist is helping people to see that there is a good side to what it is that they fear and dislike in themselves, but there is also a dark side to the bits that they pride themselves on, and that you cannot get rid of the dark side. You accept it and work with moving it towards something creative. And all creativity and all life is creative. Our mental world is creative. Our daily reality is created partly by us, not out of nowhere, but it's grounded in something else, but we help create it. That process depends on opposition. It depends on a degree of resistance, actually. And as soon as you've decided that X, Y, and Z are good, and their opposites are bad, and we must have more and more and more and more of the thing we've decided is good, you end up reaping a whirlwind, because the things you didn't take note of come back and bite you in the bum.